Brand My Podcast. This is a show for podcasters to start your podcast with confidence and elevate your voice to give your listeners a brand they can connect with. Brand My Podcast.
G'day and welcome back to Brand My Podcast. I'm Frank and I'm so grateful you're here, back listening for another episode because I'm enjoying the hell out of making this to help you start your podcast with confidence and make podcasting as easy as pressing record. Now, I'm going to dive straight into this episode because this is a crucial one when starting your podcast. So you're probably at that stage, I'm hoping, of wanting to start your podcast, but you're like, what do I call it? How do I stand out, be, clever or memorable, and all these kind of things that we're all thinking about when starting a podcast. So people can find it, search it, love it, keep listening, talk about it, all these kind of things. So think of it like starting your business or a business. I don't know whether or not you have done this before. I've started my own business and coming up with a name for that was pretty difficult. Finding one that is unique, hasn't been used. And we don't want to change the name either because it gets tricky. I mean, sure, you can change it. You're able to change it, but we don't want our listeners getting confused and having to look up a different name when they can't remember it. They keep typing in the old one and it doesn't appear. So we got to get a few different things right. Now, what we want to do from the start here, though, is just make sure we've got these first three considerations down pat. The first and most importantly here is, what is your podcast about? Because that's going to influence what your decision of naming is. The second is this tied to your business? So there's a few different pros and cons here. The first is that if you add your business name to the title of your podcast, that can help things like SEO and searchability, and it just marries everything up with your existing brand for your business so that it's consistent. All those different touch points that you have if you're on socials, if you're doing a podcast, if you have a blog, if you've got your website, you're showing up in Google, keep it, consistent. So that's an idea right there for what you could call your podcast, nice and easy. The third consideration here is, do you have an existing personal brand? An audience away from podcasting that already know you. And you can, this podcast is going to be talking about things that you know. Because I know a heap of different podcasters that simply use their name. But again, I'm going to get into that. So with that in mind, here are 5 naming conventions that I want to give you that might inspire the name for your podcast. Now, the first is, very obviously based on the topic of what you're going to be talking about in your podcast. Keeping it very simple, but also being clever to include keywords about the topic of what you're going to be talking about on that podcast. So if it's 1, 2, or 3, to give you an example, one of my podcasts, Branding Banter, if someone types in branding, it comes up, nice and simple like that you can integrate into the name. So if someone that knows nothing about you, about your podcast, or about your business, let's say, but there's a keyword in there, you're going to appear. Most likely you're going to appear, unless you're in a very saturated market, let's say. But that's a consideration for the first naming convention. The second one, to follow on from the topic of what you're talking about, is to treat it a bit more punny with something like a catchphrase or any kind of phrase that is relevant to the topic that you're talking about. You don't need to be like the wittiest person ever, but to come up with something that is just one of those aha moments or ha-ha moments that gets your listeners intrigued about what it is, because it's kind of like a book cover, A lot of us tend to judge a book by its cover. And in this instance, having something that's punny or funny or has some nice memorability about it in something like a catchphrase, it kind of rhymes maybe. It's like a book cover. It catches our attention without even hearing it. It might even be something that creates a kind of community sense out of it, which I know my favorite podcast at the moment is called BizBuds, and they've turned the name of their show into a collective kind of noun, or I'm not too sure what the grammatical term is, but they call their listeners biz buddies. So if you can create something like that, perfect. It might be a little tricky, but if you nail it, sweet. Now, the third consideration that you could have for a name is kind of like an in-joke. Something that your listeners will understand. Maybe it's some kind of symbol that you have as part of your podcast. I mean, behind me is some pink lighting, and I could have integrated the word pink or magenta or something like that into the name of my podcast. But let's say your topic of conversation is something like Star Wars, like a really niche topic of interest for you, which for me it is, and I could talk about it till the cows come home. And you named it something obscure that only a Star Wars fan would know. To connect with your listeners on that level with a kind of in-joke or reference that only that person would understand, you're right then from that first connection point of them discovering your podcast, aligning with that, message of what you're going to be talking about. So people really click with it. So let's say for Star Wars, you could call it the Tantive 4 Escape Pod cast. If you get that reference, amazing. That's a pretty niche in-joke, but a true Star Wars fan would get that. Geez, maybe I should start a podcast called that, because that is amazing, like off the top of the head. Woo! I digress, because the fourth naming convention here is, as I alluded to before, naming it after yourself. If you have a personal brand established already, or even if you don't, you're building one up, naming it after your own name can be extremely beneficial for your listeners to find you and connect with you on that personal level. I know someone who does exactly this. Her name's Claire Wood. We've connected a lot, and I've had her on one of my podcasts. And she's built a personal brand because she coaches and consults with business owners, and has just called her podcast the Claire Wood Podcast. I mean, she admittedly says it's not very inventive, but it's perfect for that type of person. Building a personal brand to have, again, everything consistent there makes it much easier. Now, there's a caveat to that. And the caveat realistically is your name easy to pronounce and spell? This was my biggest consideration when I started my own business, G'day Frank, was that having Reagan McCrill as the business name was going to be a minefield of problems, because I've had it all my life. People can't pronounce it, people can't remember it, people can't spell it. So I named it G'day Frank after my middle name. So you might not choose your full name. It could be your first name, or it could be your last name, or it could be your middle name. That's a consideration there as a type of naming convention. It keeps it real simple and easy to remember, especially if you have a built-up audience already that know you by that name. And that brings us to the last naming convention, number 5 in this list, is, as I alluded to right at the start, was naming this podcast based on your business name. So if it's the actual business name, so if I just started the G'day Frank podcast, that'd make a whole heap of sense. I named it Brand My Podcast because that was a side brand that I've created here and done it that way. It helps with SEO, as I mentioned earlier. It keeps everything consistent with your brand, and that's what I want from people that start brands and businesses, because it keeps everything consistent. So it's not a different phrase to associate with your existing brand. It keeps it nice and simple for your listeners. But that's not it. I'm going to leave you with a couple other little hints, tips, whatever it might be, when coming up with your name. And the first one is it catchy? The second is it memorable? And the third is it easy to pronounce and to spell? Because if it is, it becomes memorable right off the bat. But secondly, when someone's typing, they want to find your podcast and listen to your podcast. If you're making it hard for them with a really complicated word, don't assume that everyone can spell as great as you are, unless your podcast is about spelling and grammar and copywriting. But typically we want to make it as easy for our listeners as possible. So make it easy to pronounce and spell. It's just like my name. I didn't start G'day Frank as Reagan McCrill Design, because in my lifetime, in my 33 years, I've had problems with people pronouncing, spelling, and remembering my name. I even got called Greg when I introduced myself and said Reagan. And they said, Greg? So keep it simple. The other consideration, which has just popped into my head while talking, is having a name that could also be used in other places. So let's say like my brand, my podcast. That initially wasn't a brand that I'd established. So it's not called G'day Frank Podcast. I created something that was separate. So what I considered here when creating this name was, is there a domain name available? Is there social media handles available if I ever wanted to register that kind of thing? This is something to consider if you wanted to have a standalone brand for your podcast. So make sure that's available. But the biggest thing, obviously, which we're just totally dancing around, is that your podcast name needs to be available and no one else is using it. So get onto Apple Podcasts or onto Spotify and search that name that you've come up with, or a couple of names. Don't get attached to them too early because that's just going to cause so much heartache. So search them first, see if it's available, and then you'll know that you're good to go. And then you have a name. You can then press on to the next stage of your podcast. But with that is the end of this episode. I hope you come up with a great name. Please send me a DM with your inspired podcast name. I'd love to hear them. Or if you need help with naming your podcast, please reach out. You can find me on Instagram at @G'dayFrank or brandmypodcast.com. Shoot me an email there and I'd be happy to help you out with that. But what I've got to say to end the podcast is, please, if you are liking this podcast so far, share it with a friend or leave a review. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, that would be very much appreciated. It keeps me going, keeps me confident. And this is something that obviously you should be asking your listeners as well. With that, I will see you in the next episode. Bye.